Hi all, let's go over game 29 from the TCEC season 18 super final. So Leela in this game was playing with the white pieces against Stockfish. Let's have a look. So in this game, e4, the opening book given was on the Piot's defense. We have knight c3, which quite often prepares an Austrian attack. If black plays g6, we have the very scary looking Austrian attack. Black played c6. This has some perks to it. c6, which are about to be revealed after f4. Black has the very interesting pin on the knight. So threatening knight takes e4. This has been seen in very high level over the board chess. We see bishop d3 here protecting e4, e5. So in this way, black is fighting for the central squares. It's a very, very interesting system. Knight f3, this is the end of the book given. So here, Stockfish plays knight bd7. That seems a very logical move. White castles. Bishop e3 has been seen before in the game Topalov, Veselin Topalov against Michael Adams in the Capadage tournament of 1994. In that game, Michael Adams with the black pieces managed to get a very, very good game. I'll just quickly show you, flick through, with the knight h5 here, so threatening knight g3. This was very, very annoying for white. And then c5, threatening c4. You can see how black's position really sprang into life here with f5. Look at this tension, e4 of taking, a lot of tension there. And in fact, black managed to win the exchange rather quickly here after knight d3. Topalov didn't want to take on d3. Well, it looks like, yeah, a very, very dangerous position for losing a piece because of the f4 liability. So he ended up losing the exchange. And just to show you a bit more, so Michael Adams with black pieces provoked white into a lot of weaknesses basically. And here, after rook g5, rook takes g6, white actually resigned. So that was quite a crushing high level game back in 1994 in this line. So castling was played instead of bishop e3 here though in this game. Bishop e7, now bishop e3, black castles. If knight g4 here, bishop can drop back, and there is the threat of knight d5 looking at the queen. If e takes knight d5, taking on e7, this should guarantee white an advantage after knight takes d4. Looking at knight f5 and queen takes g4 here, white's got the advantage. So black castled h3, now depriving officially knight g4, rook e8. a4, very interesting move. We have e takes d4, which is a central tension release. You might think this is slightly suspect, but also doesn't it encourage the use of the f5 square later, and potentially isn't this diagonal dangerous? If e takes f4, then this also, it leads to a position where white should be in the driving seat here. White looks to be very comfortable there, with potentially, dangerous thrusts in the center available later. So we have, this tension release is actually played. E takes d4, bishop takes d4. We have knight f8, and now a really interesting move by Leela here. Can you guess what Leela played if I give you 10 seconds to pause the video for 100 points? White play here. Okay, the move is b4. It's a very forcing move. The queen actually retreated back on taking. Believe it or not, there's a really fantastic idea the white has here. I wondered if you worked this out when you suggested b4. a5, it blocks the queen's exit back. So there's only b2 to play with here. And for example, with b5, knight takes b5, c3, rook f2 is trapping the queen. So yeah, this is a really ingenious contraption to trap the queen here. If instead on b5, instead of b5, a6, just to show this, the knight e2 hits the queen's run out of squares, Have to give herself up for just the bishop, for example. So b4 chases the queen back. If queen h5, you might wonder, the problem is f5, it seems to secure white an advantage here if the queen's on h5 here. There's a possibility of harassing the queen pretty soon. So for example like this, this is going to be good. That was hitting the queen, unveiling an attack. And the black pawn is weak there. That's going to be an advantage. But if we look at this another way, with queen d2 as well, instead of f5, then here, this is interesting. I mean, this is more interesting. So I think f5 is the actual critical path. Instead of a5, then say h6. Then the problem is, yeah, knight e2 to f4 is really dangerous. So here, like knight f4. So yeah, it doesn't seem worth it to play this, pseudo-aggressive move, queen h5. So we have the queen going all the way back. So black's in a pretty passive position right now. And we have rook b1, b6, and the bishop drops back to f2. Knight e6, it's a nuisance move. The bishop actually goes back to e3, and you might wonder, isn't this a bit pointless? The thing is, if bishop g3, that really runs into knight h5, hitting the bishop and hitting f4. And yeah, there's a big problem there. I mean, this is only going to be equality at best for white, for example, like that. So bishop e3, taking time out against that. Bishop b7, a5, b takes, b takes. This is the start of an interesting installment which has implications for the endgame. The rook is hitting the bishop at the moment. No time to take. Well, there's other stuff as well going on. But this, potential a6 is a nuisance. The bishop actually decided to retreat back. So a6, is this a double-edged installation? Is it going to be a weakness, or is it going to be a pawn on the queen side in the endgames? So fascinating. How double-edged is the a6 pawn here? It also marks the a7 pawn, so there is an attack on a7 at the moment. So the rook is kind of passive on a8 here. So here we see queen a5, and now the knight is attacked. It's moved actually to e2. Queen c7, yeah, there's no real problem if black takes on a6, just playing rook a1. Nice skewer. That's going to be a piece for white. So queen c7, knight g3. This is a constructive use of that knight. The f5 square seems particularly sensitive here. We have rook b8, so an exchange of rooks. And now knight d4, this other knight is joining forces, but it's hitting c6 en route, potentially to using f5. Knight takes. If bishop d7 as an example, then yeah, both knights can join forces for the f5 square, and this hypermodern looking queen a1 is rather nifty. There's ideas of knight h6 sometimes, so maybe taking on a7 there if the queen moves. If the queen doesn't move, then knight h6 is nifty, and white's getting a big advantage here. This is real structural damage for black's position, so white's getting a big advantage there. So knight takes d4, we have bishop takes d4, and yeah, you might think, well, does white really have that much? There's at least two things going for white. If this pawn is dangerous, persisting into endgames, the f5 square and the glare at the king side generally with these bishops. We have c5. This compromises the d5 square, potentially. The bishop actually keeps on this diagonal. If bishop e3, it seems, for example, like this, with the pressure on e4, black could play c4, and taking here is a nifty tactic for queen b6 check, and black should be absolutely fine there. So we have bishop a1. We have now queen b6, so threatening c4 check. That's blocked. Now you might wonder, hold on a sec. Isn't the a6 pawn hanging here? Would you take on a6? Well, in fact, Stockfish didn't. Bishop e6. You might think this is rather mysterious. If taking on a6, in fact, forcing moves come into action. After bishop takes, queen takes, e5. This is actually remarkably strong in this position. There are various things going on. This bishop is potentially looking at g7. This knight is potentially hopping in. This queen is potentially going to g4, not just hitting g7, but also d7. It's a really fascinating position technically, as well as the availability of forcing moves, how the white pieces can jump into really attacking squares. And say knight d7, because if d takes, in fact, the knight is just lost in broad daylight here after f takes. The knight has no squares. So that rules out anything other than knight d7. And now it runs into a forcing move, queen g4, looking at g7 and d7. Say knight b6, then e takes, another forcing move, threatening checkmate. And here, guess what white plays, which spells total disaster for black. If I give you 10 seconds to pause the video, what would you play here? The most crushing. Okay, bishop takes g7. Yeah, it's all pretty devastating stuff after knight h5. Black would have to give up the queen to stave off being mated. Yeah, if we just look at this, the full horror of this situation, it's quite remarkable. If if queen b7, knight f5, threatening checkmate, and if here actually there's e6, and the black position, the king side, with this bishop being liberated now on a1, that's another major part of this bishop hanging around the diagonal. It's a devastating position here. With the threat of mate on f7, black's best is only queen d5. Giving up the queen, yeah, it's a total disaster. Yeah, all these disaster scenarios if bishop takes a6. Funny that, isn't it? So anyway, bishop e6 is played. And we have queen e2. So this form pawn lives another day towards the endgames. d5 is played. If bishop takes c4 here, queen takes, knight d7, rook d1, bishop f8. This position with knight f5 is just really strong for white. For example, a rook left to d3 here, looking at g7 in this scenario, is going to be, this is an absolutely winning scenario. If black doesn't do anything desperate looking, then it actually runs into a tactic here. The whole king side is dismantled. If I give you 10 seconds here, what does white do in this position? Okay. White can play knight h6 check here. So after takes, rook g3. Yeah, this is just crushing. And this is checkmate there. Queen takes f7 is checkmate. So yeah, some big dangers for the king side are echoed here. But after d5, we have a gravitation, it seems. Before we check that out, actually, there's something else. If just to rule out some other stuff, if bishop f8, because there's a gravitation towards endgames, which would seem to favour the pawn on the queen side. But if bishop f8, white can actually just take on f6 here, and this, with knight f5 and the rook left, is going to be very, very strong. Very, very strong indeed. If bishop d8 there instead, then bishop takes and queen f3. This is also a very strong position, it seems, for white. These scenarios are pretty strong. Yeah, there's sometimes an idea of sacking a pawn to pin the bishop, and the queen and bishop are sort of menacing on this diagonal in some of the variations. So yeah, there's some interesting situations. This is a very favourable endgame for white. So Stockfish is having to maybe compromise with d5. So e takes, bishop takes. So we're back to the main game where simplification, it seems, should be okay for black. Should it? After knight f5. We have queen e6 being played. If c4 check, it runs into bishop d4 actually with tempo. And here, this is just good for white, this position after rook b1. That's very nice. So queen e6 was played immediately in this version of events, leaving the pawn on c5. And yeah, Leela actually just simply took on e7. You might think, is there enough to actually win this? After bishop e5, it's a fascinating endgame scenario. We have knight b4, and now simply c3, encouraging knight takes a6. The knight actually went to c6. On knight takes a6, it runs into rook a1, and then this pin. And in this scenario, in fact, rook a5 is leaving white with a significant advantage. That pawn is going to be picked up. The bishop's rather dominating the knight here, generally, well, and supporting the passed pawn, so white should be much better there. So if we go back, knight takes a6 seems out of the question. Knight d3, there's bishop b8. And this is annoying with the idea of, for example, like this. White's always doing better. For example, if black protects with g6, then there's this remarkable tactic, bishop takes a7, because of check and then check, and the knight's too late to come back. So if we look at this again, this situation with knight d3, bishop b8, it is rather dangerous here. So just to recap here, so this situation here, if knight takes f4, then rook b7 again is good for white. Picking up that pawn with that big a pawn is going to cost black a piece here. So yeah, these are very dangerous scenarios with a frightening passed pawn for black. So knight c6 was played, not knight takes or knight d3. So we have rook b1, and you might think, well, isn't this harmless after knight takes e5, f takes? It's a fascinating endgame. We have king f7, the king comes up, the white king has extra, potentially aggressive squares. This pawn does a very interesting job in this particular position. Well, both these pawns are very, very interesting, securing white an upper hand, which is difficult to get rid of. And now g4 here, rook d7, king e4, h6. So has black set up some sort of fortress? At the moment, the king's not crossing anywhere. And where would it have a target anyway? If rook d2, then rook b7, this situation should be quite nice for white. For example, like this, white's getting an advantage. So we have h6, h5, rook c7, and you might think, well, isn't black solid enough? c4, so that fixes c5, king c7, check, and here rook b1. If instead of rook b1 here king d3, then black just takes there and king c7, and this should be absolutely equal. So rook b1, king c1, and now there's a very interesting move in this particular position, and maybe endgame gurus really like the challenge here. White play, if I give you 10 seconds to pause the video, what would you play in this position? It's a rather interesting concept, actually. So white play, okay, g5, it's a temporary pawn sack. It's ignored. If it's taken, actually, the key point is not to use the rook to drill into these pawns, but rather a king retreat to go to g4. If rook g1, then, king c7 and then king b6, and that's fine for black. So the point here is, in this variation, king f3 and king g4, and this is really troublesome for black. Black's always going to be worse here in these scenarios. For example, like this, white's better. So that is pretty fascinating. After king f3, if instead of rook d7 there, if rook d4 check, here rook b7, rook takes, this is just better for white as well. So yeah, fascinating way to sort of create inroads if that pawn sacrifice was accepted, but it wasn't. So rook d7, and we have g6, which means there's another key outpost square on f7. So there's two key outpost squares for the rook. This king is not yet optimal. There is a target on c5. The king really needs to kind of potentially reroute. Potatoes, you say potatoes, we say. Anyway, so king, going to c5 is a dangerous idea, hitting c5. So we have here rook d4 check, and the rook just goes back. It dare not take on c4 here because of rook b7. This situation is too much with those passed pawns like that. For example, like this, the king can actually also get involved. It's just winning for white. So we have rook d7, rook f1, rook e7, and it's here with this bridge being open temporarily for the white king to travel, and it uses that travel pass, king d3. So it wants to try and get to c5. Check, king c3. So black is pretty passive here. Rook f7, king c6, rook f8. Yeah, because the king's too far away on taking. So rook f8, rook e7, rook d8, king c7, rook d6. So this is tying up the black rook, protecting just e6. And now the king, statistically going backwards before going forwards. And now king a4. And here, yeah, I mean, king b5 is happening. So the rook lets e6 go, actually. If rook e7, then the king coming to b5 is pretty decisive stuff. So the rook lets the pawn go. And after king e8, rook c6. Here, this situation now, there is a nifty tactical move. And you might think, well, wow, really? Guess what white plays here, which is actually rather technically important to play. So white to play here, what does white play here? What's the idea here? 10 seconds to pause the video. White to play here. You think these rook and pawn endings are pretty simple, but if you have to play moves like this, okay, it's rook b6. In this situation, because the king's on the back row, there's no time to take here because of a7. There's no time to get back because it's check, queening with check. So that's immune here to take that. So we have rook h4. And now rook b7. And we've got a situation with two mega passed pawns now on both sides of the board. In fact, 3 passed pawns, if you include that one. And the king's also coming up, so white's got all the sort of trump cards. The game actually ended here. If it continues as an example, say rook g4, king c3, rook g1. I mean, something's going to have to give way. So say this situation. It's going to be winning a rook there in the game, as an example. So I'll take you to the game end. So I thought that was actually a rather fascinating kind of endgame pawn installation. And there were absolute fireworks if black had dared take it at one key moment. And even in that endgame, the tactical moves like rook b6 being needed. It's fascinating. In many different ways, this game. So I hope you got something from it. They're really loaded with very, very interesting questions and answers, these very, very high-level games. I think much more so than Human Over the Board games. Fascinating resources are being revealed here. Fascinating questions and answers, basically. Such high-level chess. Okay, so if you want to follow the playlists, by the way, bit.ly/Leela Chess, bit.ly/Stockfish Chess. So these are the evolving playlists from looking at these super finals. between Stockfish and Leela. And also, if you want to challenge me for a game, kingscrusher.tv or bit.ly/chessworld. If you just register there, I'll be able to invite you for a game later. There's the Suave Kingscrusher TV/Discord. We've got game suggestions from there. It's getting pretty lively. Okay, comments, questions, like, share, subscribes with the notification bell. Really appreciated. Thanks very much.